Well, welcome, friends, to another installment of Strange Planet. And on this episode, we are stepping into the courtroom, not for a murder trial, but for one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Did a UFO really crash near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947? And if so, why has the truth been buried under decades of denial, disinformation, and ridicule? Joining me is Christopher A. Johnston, a veteran trial attorney, certified civil trial specialist, and lifelong UFO researcher. He's argued before the Iowa Supreme Court, holds certifications in both astrobiology and space law, and is a contributing member of MUFON, the world's most respected UFO research organization. But today, Chris isn't just making legal arguments, he's placing truth itself on trial. In his riveting new book, Roswell, The Truth on Trial, The Evidence Speaks, You Decide, he brings the legendary 1947 Roswell crash to life in a dramatic courtroom setting with real eyewitness testimony, sworn affidavits, and historical documents. He constructs the case as though the reader were sitting in the jury box, forced to weigh the evidence and deliver a verdict. This is the X-Files meets Law and Order, with the future of UFO disclosure hanging in the balance. Is this the book that finally cracks the case wide open? Let's find out. Chris, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Good morning, Richard. I am doing well.
Fantastic. So as a veteran trial attorney, and you've argued before the Iowa Supreme Court, what compelled you to put the Roswell crash on trial in your book? And why did you choose this case, this moment, to re-examine it in a courtroom drama format?
Sure. Well, for good or bad, a lot of what we do and a lot of what we see out there in the UFO world and that realm, as you know, there's not a lot of new information. We'll see the new stuff comes along, the Tic Tac videos, the what have yous. But some of the bigger, the more compelling stories like Roswell have been around, over 70 years, and really nothing new coming out of it. You might see a snippet, you might hear this or that. So as a trial attorney, I thought, well, if we don't have new information coming out, maybe what we need is a new way to look at the old information. And you ask, why now? Well, we all see the conspiracy theories running rampant, the world being the way the world is. And I thought, well, doggone it, maybe we can present this information in a way that hasn't been presented before. And also with the backdrop as functioning as a juror, perhaps provide people with another way, a more critical way to look at evidence in other cases. So Roswell I chose because, one, it's Roswell, and two, I knew that there's plenty of information out there that I could compile into the book. I looked at some of the other cases, some of the more popular cases, your Betty and Barney Hills of the world, things like that. But there just wasn't enough out there to create, in my opinion, one book about it. So I selected Roswell due to its enduring intrigue. Two, I knew there'd be enough information. And three, like I mentioned, to give folks perhaps a way to look at information that they haven't looked at in that format before.
Well, it's an amazing premise, placing the reader in the juror's seat, tasking them with rendering the verdict on this incident. Was this a deliberate attempt to bypass media, government narratives, and empower the public to judge the truth?
Right. That's exactly what it is. And that is the truth behind any jury trial. It's simply not, now I should default with my book, for example. There are, of course, some evidentiary issues. So if any of your sharp-eyed, legal-minded types of listeners were to read it, is there some hearsay that snuck in there? Well, certainly. I had to be able to carry the narrative forward, if you will. So there are some little bits that, as a trial lawyer, I kind of cringed putting in because I knew it didn't meet the evidentiary standard necessarily, but I did the best that I could. So bypassing the media and questions like that, you're exactly right. You go to trial, if you have a piece of evidence and the court determines that piece of evidence is admissible, I don't care if you're Fox News or Al Jazeera or who we are. It's coming in, and the jury can look at that and draw their own conclusions for it. So I do believe jury trials, they're not perfect, but certainly I think it's about the best way to really get to the truth of a matter. And even if someone is to lose a case, that doesn't change the facts. It's just that particular groups of jurors' perception of the facts. And that's why sometimes cases will get relitigated with different looks at it, because we as the lawyer, well, we lost, on that approach, and here were the weaknesses and strengths, and we could repackage it up and perhaps bring it in another court in a different format. So just losing isn't always losing, but it's getting you closer to finding the truth.
So obviously, when we're litigating or relitigating Roswell, it's a race against the Undertaker. I think all of the principal, witnesses, the Lieutenant Walter Houts, the Jesse Marcells, Blanchard, Roger Ramey, they're long gone. Now even the children of Roswell, let's call them, are getting up there. Many of them are now gone. Jesse Marcel Jr. Is gone. So how do you, just take us inside when you were putting this case together, how do you approach the evidence when the witnesses, the second-hand witnesses, are no longer with us?
Sure. And I'm glad you asked that. I would say 95% of the testimony that you will find in Roswell, the Truth on Trial, the answers given by the witnesses were drawn from previous interviews that they've given. So it's that historical fact, if you will, in that the testimony is things that they've actually already really said. Then the questioning, there are times on cross where I really went after the various witnesses, but I intentionally took more of a plaintiff lawyer approach to it with the open-ended questions, so that the lawyer wasn't changing the story or driving the story. It's really the story is being told through previous interviews given by the players.
What would you say is the most damning piece of evidence presented in this trial that suggests the U.S. government covered up the true nature of the Roswell crash? Why does it stand out as well, in, let's say, in the context of your legal analysis?
Sure. Well, let me back up. One of the real problems with any kind of book about a trial is you don't get to see the witnesses. You don't get to hear the witnesses. And there is so much of what we do as trial lawyers that deals with credibility. So, for example, I could say this witness really tanked it or really didn't carry the day, whereas in reality, if that witness were on the stand and we could see the mannerisms and hear the tone and the catch and that kind of thing, would really, it goes a long distance. Unfortunately, we have this kind of sterile look at these witnesses. That said, and maybe I could do this in a different approach, if you wouldn't mind. Best witnesses for the believers. Okay, so through my book, by the way, it's structured. The plaintiffs are the believers, and the skeptics would be the defendants in a civil trial, is what we're looking at here. So interestingly, for this, my opinion, the best two witnesses for the believers are Mac Brazel and Jesse Marcel. Now, again, we don't get to see and how they would hold up, but in particular, Mac Brazel, no axe to grind, no interest in the thing. And he came right on and said, hey, looked unusual to me. If this were a real trial, I think Mr. Brazel would have carried the day, depending on how his testimony came in.
Mac was the New Mexico rancher who discovered the debris on his property near Corona in June, I think, or early July 47. Found the metallic sticks, the rubber strips, the tinfoil, the glossy paper-like material, and then he brought that to Sheriff George Wilcox after hearing about flying saucer sightings.
Right.
And your second witness, did you say, was Jesse Marcel? Major Jesse Marcel. Yeah.
Major Jesse Marcel would have been second, or right up there with Mac. Again, one of the first people on the scene. His testimony throughout and the interviews he's given, it just seems to seep with credibility and a man that was really kind of conflicted. And between those two, being two of the very first witnesses involved in it, I think their story holds up and their credibility. The first two, they had no profit motive at that point. They had no real interest in this other than, hey, here's what happened out on the ranch. So I really like those two for the believers.
And I just sort of fill in for listeners not overly
Sure.
familiar with Roswell. Major Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer at the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield. This was, of course, before the United States Air Force. And that was home, the 509th Bomb Group, to the only nuclear-equipped unit in the world at the time. And he went out to investigate Mac Brazel's debris and recover it. He described the material lightweight, strong, unlike anything terrestrial, including foil that couldn't be crumpled permanently. And he was also involved in the initial press release claiming a flying disc had been downed, I guess. All right, now, so those are the two best witnesses for the believers, the two best witnesses for the defendants, the skeptics.
For the skeptics, I'm going to go with General Ramey being their best witness. And again, drawing tone and whatnot from different statements that he's made. My struggle with General Ramey is this. He seems very no nonsense, very exactly what we would expect from a general in the military. However, he concedes that a mistake was made when the first press release came out, hey, we've got this disc. And now Ramey did the smart thing and he owns it when asked about it. Well, geez, that's quite a mistake. He does own it and simply says, yes, it was a mistake, then sticks to his guns otherwise. I struggle to believe that General Ramey would make that mistake. However, let's give him the benefit of the doubt that a mistake was made. And aside from that, he's really stuck to his guns on, with no nonsense, no superfluous stuff, just simply, no, Project Mogul, it was a weather balloon. And then one of the most intriguing witnesses, and, you can tell me the way that you would think this would go. But it would be Walter Haut with his two affidavits and the conflicting affidavits.
He was he was the public information officer at the airfield, and he was the one who he issued the press release saying he was the one that released the initial press release. We had recovered a flying disc, right? Then the next day,
correct,
it was retracted, and they said no, it was a weather balloon.
Right. And he, during the course of his life then, he executed two affidavits about this incident. One was in 93 and one was in 2002. And he would be one of those interesting witnesses where both the plaintiff and the defense, or the believers and the skeptics, they both would want to get their hands on this guy, and that it really is up to the interpretation of the jury. Because Mr. Haut's first affidavit that he executed in 93, the focus was really on the writing of the press release itself. Now now an affidavit comes out in 2002, 9 years later, and he's talking about having seen bodies. And so you tell me, the lawyers in my book kind of go after him as lawyers would do on that. Our memories tend not to get sharper over time. They get a little bit weaker. And really problematic, in my opinion, to execute an affidavit and then throw in a little factoid, 11 years later, oh, by the way, there were some bodies. So again, what would a jury, really do with that? So it's an interesting legal setup because, again, he would be a, quote, great witness for the plaintiff, great witness for the defense. What weight does the jury go on it? And what weight do they put into that second affidavit, now talking about bodies?
Right. And Haut later co-founded the International UFO Museum in Roswell. does that detract from his credibility that he's basically opening a business around Roswell?
Right. Well, I don't think it's necessarily for me to say it detracts from it, but again, looking at it as an attorney, and you get into bias. I wrote an article in MUFON magazine applying the federal rules of evidence to various UFO topics. And and Richard, I lost my train there on what your actual question was. I'm sorry.
Oh, we were talking about how Lieutenant Walter Haut, had later opened or co-founded the International UFO Museum in Roswell.
Right.
You know, they do charge admission, as far as I know. So
Right.
there's a
Right. And bias is the one of the biggest categories. You know, in my job, I will cross-examine, defense experts all the time. And that's very much one of those, mock it up quickly. Oh, Dr. Smith, and you were hired by the defendant in this case. Yep, that's right. And then I get to ask Dr. Smith, how many times have you been hired by them? How much do you get paid by them? How much have you earned by them? So bias is very much a big category that in our actual everyday practice we attack. So yes, you go and you set up a store, and wouldn't your store, your museum be a little bit more compelling if you were a little bit more plugged into the story itself? It's an easy argument to make. I don't know that that's the case, but it certainly is an area that I and my colleagues would be all up on this guy on that very topic.
You also mentioned Brigadier General Roger Ramey. He was the commander of the 8th Air Force. He was based in Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. He oversaw the retraction of the flying disc claim. Said that the debris was from a weather balloon. Held a press conference displaying. Many of us have seen that famous photograph where we see the debris laid out on the floor, the foil, the rubber, the wood. Which Jesse Marcel later claimed was substituted for the real material. Ramey's role in shaping the official narrative is central to the accusations of a cover-up. I mean, if you had the opportunity to cross-examine General or Brigadier General Roger Ramey about that, switching out, according to Jesse Marcel, the switching out of that material and staging that photograph, what would you ask him?
Well, I would certainly take some time to make some hay about the geography. Okay. So we have the item, recovery in New Mexico, and then he's down in Fort Worth. So I think, a lot of time would be spent on the when specifically were you told? Because at least in my research, it was never entirely clear whether Ramey saw the materials, then got into it, or was explaining the materials and got back into it. So I would spend a lot of time on that chain of custody, if you will, on, that the information, how it traveled to Ramey, and then Ramey's decision-making after it. Because my impression is not that General Ramey and the powers that be gathered around the materials once they had been relocated. It was it sort of seemed to me to be an ongoing event, and then suddenly, boom, we got the retraction. So that would be my first area of, exploration with General Ramey, is how this went down and how he first got the actual information.
Who do you think is more credible? Jesse Marcel and his claim that the debris for that photograph was switched out to put in weather balloon debris, or Roger Ramey?
Again, I would put more weight into Jesse Marcel's testimony, because there's an exception to hearsay, which doesn't 100% apply right here, but it's called an excited utterance. So typically hearsay, you're not allowed to say, oh, and then Richard said blah, blah, blah. But under the exception of excited utterance, you go outside, you see your next door neighbor getting abducted, you get back on the Zoom and you're telling me, hey, Chris, holy cow. Well, that may then come in as an excited utterance by Richard, as an exception to the hearsay rule. And as you'll find with me, Richard, I get my mouth in front of my brain. And
No, that's okay. Not a problem. Sheriff Wilcox, does he take the stand in your book?
He does not. I don't have Sheriff Wilcox. I do, interesting, Loretta Proctor is in my book, and Loretta Proctor is actually the first person, perhaps maybe than family members, that Mac Brazel shared the material with. And she is the one that encouraged him, pardon me, to take it to the sheriff. So I do have Loretta on the stand in my book, and that's very much by design. Another person, sort of like Mac. She's not in the military. She's got a hard life. She's doing her thing, and the neighbor shows up with this weird material. So sheriff doesn't make it. There's certainly some talk, of Mr. Brazel presenting it to him, but I have Mac and Loretta and then Jesse. And since we're on to Loretta, I would put the weight of her testimony also quite high on my list of players.
Brazel at one point changed his story, but that was after. Now I don't know if this has been proven, but he was wasn't he taken to the 509th or holed up in a hotel with either military or police, and some suggestion that he was maybe roughed up a little bit even, or pressured to change his story?
Yes, and that is touched on in my book. And I got about the same amount of detail that you did on that. He was held at a location for a number of days. From what I found, not physically roughed up, but it was made clear that this was supposed to be treated in a confidential manner. So, and again, from an evidentiary standpoint, a little bit of weakness on well, who told you that? I couldn't find the answers to that as well. But again, one of the challenges with a historical book.
Mm-hmm. So. And just getting back to Sheriff George Wilcox again, he was sheriff of Chavez County in Roswell. Reports that he was under pressure to downplay the story, but further, I believe it was according to maybe his daughter, she claimed that he was also pressured to threaten some of the residents, some of the witnesses, and told, don't speak about this. Otherwise, basically you'll be disappeared. It's a big desert out there. No one will ever find you, that kind of thing. And then he felt so horrible about it after. He didn't run for re-election in Chavez County. Did you uncover any testimony relating to Wilcox's alleged threats to the residents?
Other than I read along the way that there were some alleged threats. They didn't make it into my book. Again, I didn't have daughter on the stand, but I have heard that certainly along the way.
The idea that this story kind of remained dormant, like after 47, we don't really hear about it again until like 1978, I think, when Stanton Friedman interviews Jesse Marcel. So that's like 30 years later. How does that affect the case and the credibility of the case, that it was kind of dead in the water for 30 years?
I don't think it really. Time doesn't change the facts. Mm-hmm. Time will certainly change memories. I don't think the delay in time doesn't take anything away from the story itself, but as we alluded to when we first started talking, it certainly dilutes the evidence. It certainly dilutes memories. And as a trial lawyer, I sure would I'd rather be trying a case that happened 2 years ago than 30, 40, 70 years ago. And some of that, I suppose, is just societal. It's a lot easier to ignore something or to poo-poo something if it was before I was born or what have you. But the facts itself, the case itself, still has all the intrigue and twists and turns. It's just the ability to get all the existing information to truly, put the whole thing to bed.
Colonel William Blanchard, He was the commanding officer at the 509th Bomb Group. He ordered the recovery of the debris. He authorized the flying disc press release. And then after the retraction, he reportedly went on leave. Some ufologists interpret that as a tactic to avoid press scrutiny. I mean, his role in the initial announcement and subsequent silence made him kind of a focal point for cover-up theories. Does Blanchard get on the stand and, I guess using your expertise in cross-examination, what would you most want to question under oath him about?
But when when it was determined that we were going to redo the press release, and the 5 minutes before and after that is where I would really spend the majority of my cross. You know, the precise who said what or what did you see, because that was never even entirely clear why Blanchard was on board with the change. You know, and that goes back to, it was just simply General Ramey saying this is what we're doing. You know, that was difficult to say. And tied in there, Richard, are you familiar with Captain Sheridan Cavett in this whole story?
No.
What I find intriguing about him, he was if not the counterintelligence officer assigned to the base. And of course, from moment one, at least everything I was able to find from moment one, Captain Cavett was saying, oh no, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. And I find that very interesting because he was the counterintelligence officer. And it's not too dissimilar from what we have going on now with the pushes for disclosure and the players that are involved. And can a counterintelligence officer ever be trusted? Or the mere fact that, you know, that Cavett is saying no, is that an indicator right there? Well, we got counterintelligence saying no, so it may be a yes. So I just wanted to mention him because I thought he doesn't come up all that often, but he's certainly in the lore.
There were a couple of individuals who asserted they were involved in transporting alien bodies from the Roswell incident. Captain Oliver Pappy Henderson, he was a pilot with the 1st Air Transport Unit at Roswell Army Field. His wife, this was an interview, I think, on Unsolved Mysteries. She said that her husband told her he flew small non-human bodies with large heads, slanted eyes to Wright Pat Air Force Base in Ohio. There was another account from a Lieutenant Marion Black Mac Magruder. He was a Marine Corps pilot. He claimed he was shown small alien bodies at Wright Pat in 47. During a debriefing, his son, Mark Magruder, recounted this in a 1997 interview, that his father described the beings as small, hairless, large eyes, no visible ears or nose. What are your thoughts on their testimony, or their children or spouses' testimony?
Yep, good question. And they were considered, but for my book, they didn't make the cut. And instead, I went with Melvin Brown and Glenn Dennis. And so starting first with Mr. Brown, he was a military police officer based at Roswell, and he testified that he saw bodies. Well, that's what it started at, is always the case. He started out saying he saw bodies. Then as it got a little bit more refined, he indicated that he did see a crate with what appeared to possibly be bodies in it. I also like Melvin Brown, and I called him as a rebuttal witness in my book. Really, the lower level players I always find more intriguing than the Ramies of the world, because those are the folks that usually have less incentive to lie. And Melvin Brown said that he saw something, you know, again, started as bodies and then morphed into, well, it was a crate and there was some weird stuff in the crate. And I maybe saw a head, but I chose to go with him relative to viewing the bodies. And then Glenn Dennis, you know, the local undertaker there in Roswell. Yes.
Right.
So I went with those two. Yeah, Mr. Dennis also very interesting, very compelling witness. Why would he possibly lie and say he was contacted about small caskets? And that was very early on. So he would have had a lot of lying foresight, I think, to start saying the things that he was saying.
Right. So this was in the late 80s, I think. He claimed he received calls from the Roswell airfield inquiring about child-sized caskets. He also said he was told by a nurse friend about alien autopsies at the base. He said he was threatened by military personnel to stay silent. So did you find his testimony useful, compelling, credible?
I did. I found him credible, again, based in the limited world of evidence that we're forced to work with in 2025. I found him credible, and I started going down this rabbit hole. In fact, I found him so credible, but nobody has any information on the nurse.
Yeah.
You know, she'll pop up frequently. I originally am from St. Paul, Minnesota. I had read that this nurse allegedly was from St. Paul, but she split, in 1947 and went back to the Twin Cities, apparently. I'm really surprised and disappointed that nobody has really gone down the rabbit hole on that nurse. Now, at this point, what would that actually be worth? But I think Mr. Dennis is fairly compelling, and that doggone hearsayed nurse, boy, would I like to get my hands on any information about her.
Right. She was present at the autopsy. She commented on the smell. She described the bodies. There were some illustrations of the bodies based on her, I guess, secondhand testimony or through Glenn Dennis. Your book, aside from the sworn affidavits and eyewitness accounts, there are some. I mean, were there any documents you uncovered that shook your own beliefs about what happened in 47?
No, unfortunately, no new documents. I didn't unearth anything that wasn't already out there in the ether. If I had unlimited time and unlimited resources, I'm confident I could find, plenty existing out there, including that nurse we were just talking about. But no, I didn't unveil, the next great smoking gun, unfortunately.
You've introduced the infratempestrial hypothesis.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Sure. Well, it's it's not the most elegant word choice, but there's the current theory you're probably familiar with of the extratempestrials, written up by, I think it's Dr. Masters from Montana State University. And his theory, in short, is that the extraterrestrials that come here now, are actually us from the future, time traveling. And so I really like the concept. It's different, it's unique, it's plausible. And as I thought it through with, some of my astrobiology background, I started thinking, well, who says it's us from the future? Couldn't it just as well be us from before? So if the Earth being 3.5 to 5 billion years old, who knows what happened in that time frame? So as I just started it almost as a thought exercise, I was like, well, the infratempestrials would be under us in time or before us in time. And so it's a bit of a play on words given what Dr. Masters is doing. But it's my theory and my concept is that extraterrestrials could have been Earth-based 3.5, 4 billion years ago with their own technology. Something happened, then they split, but they still have the ability to come back, just as Dr. Masters said. But the thing, kind of an Occam's razor angle of the infratempestrials, is it eliminates the time travel angle.
Right.
There's still a lot that would have to be believed and accepted for either of them to work, certainly. However, if the technology existed at one point and we were able to do it, who's to say that it's us and it's time traveling when it could just be us from before a time that we know? And you get into kind of the rock record and the fossil record and what's missing. Well, as we know, so little of the fossil record is fully fleshed out. There's that angle. And then bringing it into very current sense, I just read this study about a month ago, and it's researchers, I believe, in Denmark, but they have figured out how to turn a stem cell into what they're calling a supercell, and it's by changing their energy source. So most cells take glucose for their energy. Well, these scientists starved it of glucose, gave it a different kind of energy source, and they took to it, and now they're calling them super stem cells. So as that goes into the extra or the infratempestrials, if the energy source for these cells 3.5 billion years ago were different than what they are now, then too couldn't we expect the life forms to be that different? So it was a very interesting, very recent study on just changing the source of energy for cells.
In court, motive is obviously critical to building a case. What do you believe was the primary motive behind the Roswell cover-up? National security, tech control, societal stability, something deeper? What?
Yes, all those things. And it is, I think it's all the things that we're still being told. The classic, we can't handle the truth. Government's trying to hoard the technology. And I can believe bits and pieces of all of that. One of my struggles, however, is if you're telling me that Richard is sitting on something that would change the world, somebody on your team is going to talk. Just the absolute lockdown and the silence just doesn't seem quite possible.
You have certifications in astrobiology, space law. What are the global legal implications? I mean, if a UFO crash with non-human occupants is confirmed, how prepared is the international legal framework to address something like that?
That good question, and I would take a stab at it and say probably poorly. So much of what is going on right now, even though I am involved in space law, and to sort of clarify that space law angle, currently most of the day-to-day, the legal practitioners that are involved in space law, most of that is involved on the defense side. And by that, I don't necessarily mean military defense. The insurance companies are just starting to get their products up to speed. Richard's satellite crashes into Chris's satellite. Okay, now what are we going to do? So the work that I'm doing and looking at is really along those lines, the actual day-to-day type of space law. I'm less involved. It's more of a hobby and passion on, say, like the UN treaties of outer space and how those are going to impact and whatnot. And that in part will probably answer your question is I'm sure you're familiar with the various UN treaties. Turn on the TV and what we see going on, China, hey, we're going to go mine on the moon. Well, not according to the UN treaties, you're not going to do that. So again, it's toothless international treaties, yet countries are seeming to run amok in space. So my interest is really, again, working with the insurances and that kind of thing, and then studying the policies on the side. As a traditional plaintiff lawyer, I have yet to see the case where Richard got hit with a piece of space debris walking down Fifth Avenue. That is the case that I would actually want. We haven't gotten to that point, yet, but we are starting to see, well, planes are delayed on the runways because we had, a SpaceX explode. So now we're all sitting and waiting. So people are starting to experience what we call actual damages. Now, granted, time and thing isn't, but I've got a real eye on that on the plaintiff side, where that's going, as I'm kind of working over here in the more mundane insurance coverages for space products sort of thing.
Getting back to the Roswell trial, something I neglected to ask you about, and that is physical evidence. We talked about testimony and affidavits and documents, but alleged Roswell debris, obviously that would be critical in a case like this. Is there any physical evidence you find most persuasive, and how do you present it to a jury to counter the official weather balloon narrative?
Sure. Well, due to the parameters of life, I had no real evidence. I mean, actual tactile, show me kind of evidence. I talk about it in the book. I have it explained in the book, as far as they're taking testimony on, I had the hieroglyphs on it and this and that kind of thing. So it's explained. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there is no actual evidence out there. And wouldn't that solve the question, right? In the year 2025, here it is, get the testing. We probably wouldn't even need a jury trial at that point. So where it is, who has it, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but it's nowhere that I'm getting access to.
Right. Much of that testimony came from Jesse Marcel Jr. because his father brought a box of this debris home, I guess, and scattered it on the kitchen floor. And Jesse was, I guess, 10, 11 at the time, and he talked about the this memory material, the foil that you crumple it up and it wouldn't stay crumpled up. He talked about little metallic pieces with look like hieroglyphics on them and so forth. Of course, he faced incredible scrutiny and intimidation after he spoke out about that. I mean, as an attorney, how do you protect a witness like that in a modern trial?
So imagine for a moment we get to court and we have Jesse Marcel and we want to protect him from the ridicule and the hate. Well, one way you go about it is by being, the most professional attorney that you can be. And so you're couching what can sound like outlandish fact patterns, but a lot of it, as my wife would say, it's all in the delivery. And, you present this material in a thoughtful, compassionate, caring way. And in a worst case scenario, if the jury sees that, well, they believe what they're saying, that goes a long way to helping your clients. Hey, you might not have won, but it was because of this and this, and not because they think that you're crazy. Now, can people get out and, society's going to do what society does? Sure. And from time to time, I'll serve as a spokesperson for my clients, depending on the type of case. And that's fairly effective. They can kind of stay hidden in their living room, and any words that need to be said about the case, they come from me, and then I can package them in such a way to, avoid some of the more outlandish tones of it.
So beyond Roswell, what role could the legal system play in achieving a broader UFO disclosure? I mean, how might Roswell, the truth on trial, inspire future legal or public efforts to uncover the truth about ETs?
Well, one, I'm hoping, kind of a side point, the book is also an excellent legal primer for future lawyers. Not everyone's going to catch it, but there's a lot of standard type of objections that we make. And then there's certain kinds of workarounds to set objections that we make. The book is full of them, and that was by design. And what I'm hoping is I could encourage someone who is a UFO fan to maybe consider the law, or vice versa. That was it. It's not intended to be a never the twain shall meet. I want there to be that overlap. And by taking such an interesting historical look, I'm hoping that might inspire someone to say, kind of like I did, well, you can do this with anything. You can run any type of fact pattern through sort of a jury background to get us, again, closer to the truth. You don't always necessarily get 100% to the truth, but you get closer. And as lawyers as a whole, I have no doubt you're familiar with Danny Sheehan.
Oh, yes.
And what he's got going on over at the New Paradigm Institute, as far as using lawyers to push disclosure, boy, he's really knocking it out of the park. As far as the team he has put together and the lobbying that he's able to do and the bills that have been put together, I think he has one it's made it through the Senate and just pending passage through the House as far as disclosure of things greater than X years ago. I'm drawing a blank on the details, but that's how you do it. Not just the FOIA requests, and that's not all Danny's doing, but FOIA and appeals to FOIA denials and the ability to, as Mr. Sheehan is doing, get with a team that are attorneys so we understand, how the cases come together and the pieces that we need. And then also having the ability and the people to actually do the legal work itself. So those are kind of the two biggest, ways that the lawyers can really help out.
Roswell, the truth on trial. The evidence speaks, you decide. Christopher A. Johnston. How do we get a copy, Chris?
Yep, thanks for asking. The absolute easiest way is I go to my personal website, which there's a button on the homepage, but it's lawgroupofiowa.com. About halfway down the page is a big red button that says buy the Roswell book. And I would like to mention, I'm quite a historian. I'm sitting right now in my courtroom, as I told you, but this is also a law museum. And on my website, if you have any interest in history, generally speaking, you'll find a lot of my exhibits are all online as well. Just kind of fun.
Fantastic. Hey, Chris, great meeting you. Thank you. Great premise for a book. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.